Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to the final thesis milestone presentation for Gulmeena Barlas for her thesis. I'm Mark Ogilewski and I'll be chairing the session. I'm the program representative. The work has been supervised by Arthur Wigglesworth and Colin Ripley is the second reader. And we also have Marco Polo present, who is the associate chair for the Master of Architecture program. I'd also like to welcome our guest reviewers who are joining us for this particular session. We have with us Andrew King and Evan Weber. So just going to do a short introduction. So Andrew King studied in engineering and theatre at Arcadia University and worked as a professional actor before studying architecture. His first decade of practice was spent primarily in Europe, including in the office of Zaha Hadid in London.
You guys.
Since 2003, Andrew's been the Canada Council of Prix d'Art Rome laureate, spending a year using the historic and contemporary gates of Rome to examine the relationship between exile and identity. The resulting project, Romalux, is a speculation on architectural curation and a cinematic space, which has subsequently been exhibited across Canada and abroad. Since 2016, Andrew has been Chief Design Officer for the Montreal-based LeMay firm, where he's led on some large projects, including the $2 billion CHUM Super Hospital in Montreal. Andrew is also a professor in practice for the Peter Gu Hua Fu School of Architecture at McGill University. So welcome, Andrew. Evan Weber is an award-winning filmmaker and an architect who has received some of the most prestigious honors and awards for his film work and his architectural projects. Evan's art direction for The Handmaid's Tale Season 1 was awarded a Primetime Emmy and an Art Directors Guild Award. He's also proud of his contribution to Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water as assistant art director, which won many awards. Similarly, Evan's pivotal role on several architectural projects have been recognized with Governor General Awards for design excellence. Evan's varied expertise has led to frequent participation as adjudicator and juror for film awards, public art competitions, and architectural commissions. He's also received invitations as visiting lecturer and requests to attend graduate design school critique panels. And I think in the past, Evan has taught at Ryerson University. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Just to go through the process today, Gulmeena will have about 20 minutes or so to present her work. I'll then ask for any questions of clarification. So these are just questions if something wasn't clear or you want a bit more information about anything. And then after that, we'll have a discussion and some feedback to Gulmeena about the work. And after about an hour or just under an hour, the committee will go into private sitting to we'll ask Gulmeena and the audience to leave, and we will then discuss the thesis and the outcome of the thesis, and then Arthur will be asked to feed back the outcome to Gulmeena at the end of the day, or the end of the session. So Gulmeena, are you ready to go?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming.
So over to you, and, yeah, if you want to go through.
Yep. So this is cinematic space, and I have the video that I will be playing. Cinematic space investigates the coexisting relationship of cinema and architecture. By incorporating ideologies of film and designing architectural space, this thesis stands as another experiment in the conversation of fusing cinematic qualities in architectural design. In this thesis, cinema is used as a lens to explore and enhance the substantial connections that have always linked film and facial awareness, uncover the already present cinematic qualities of architecture, and translate the camera, editing, and narrative techniques into the architectural paradigm to develop conscious design. The presentation consists of 4 sections. The first focuses on exploring the cinematic techniques in film and their relationship to space. The second section explores the 4 cinematic composition elements that were derived from case studies and design experiments and applied into architecture. The last section is the design project where the cinematic techniques are deployed into the typology of a rest hut to explore cinematic space. Infusing cinema and architecture reveals opportunities to further develop visual and experiential elements in design. In his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Walter Benjamin discusses the experience of architecture in comparison to other media forms. Where vision is the primary mode of experiencing film, Benjamin asserts that cinema and architecture are also absorbed similarly through the tactile sense. In film, the camera and editing technique contain the ability to apprehend the haptic properties of physical space and present it to an audience in a captivating manner. Architecture, however, lacks the intense absorption of human and space as seen in the experience of watching a film due to the rising development of banal and passive environments. Furthermore, architectural space is often designed as a final product that becomes a static end in the landscape. It resists the ability to change with time and is conceived to be paused in its original state indefinitely. The interpreted components that assemble the language of film and are also common to architecture are space, movement, time, and event. Bernard Tschumi was one architect who experimented with the crossover between architectural and performance ideas in the early 80s. Tschumi argued that in parallel to cinema's manifestation in the movement of the camera and the protagonist in a particular space, architecture is also conceived by space movement and what happened in it, the action or event. Using cinematic composition, sequencing, and framing of events, Tschumi consciously deployed film techniques into his entry for Le Parc de la Villette competition from 1984. By representing and choreographing the architectural experience of the city and applying cinematic technique, it allows architecture to reform the relationship of space and event. Alternately, cinema is also referenced in deriving relationship between the art and imagery and spatial representation. Juhani Palasma defined cinematic architecture as the architecture of imagery expressed in films. He especially notes the significance of architecture in events that transpire in films, stating that an event obtains its meaning through the time of day, location, weather, and soundscape. Consequently, cinematic architecture is also constructed by paying attention to these traits and applying them into architectural design. By enhancing the details of the space and the interaction and emphasizing time, the event will be enriched cinematically. Furthermore, Pascal Schoening is another architect that argues for cinematic architecture as a method of production in the use of film medium in the design process and a way of thinking that includes processes, change, and time. By including cinematic techniques in the design process, the creation of space is outside of the normal conventions, as seen in the Pompidou Center, where the function is separated from the event. The building acts like a film set, where the main stage is the centerpiece of focus for the audience. In this case, the inside and everything that helps compose the scene is out of view. The human perception of space is directly related to the movement and experience of the body in relation to the environment. There are three themes in film composition that establish the list of cinematic techniques to be translated. Camera techniques, which investigate concepts such as the shooting methods, framing, and focus. Editing techniques, which are methods such as cut, montage, and dissolve. And narrative techniques, which will explore the portrayal of emotions. The placement of the camera and what will be shown in the frame is all dependent on the essence trying to be conveyed to the audience. In this example from the film Nostalgia, the landscape of a village overlaid within a Gothic cathedral, then onto the exterior unknown reality shown through the falling snow demonstrate that use of tracking and wide shot to elude alternating spatial realities that are a surprise to the viewer. The viewer becomes engrossed in the dynamic images and attempt to place meaning to the scene. To conclude, cinematic space created by filmic techniques is the whole understanding of spatial reality. The parallel investigation of being John Malkovich as a case study showcases the tactile quality of film and how it can be represented in architectural space. The image is showing the intimate moment when the hand is dragging across the floor and fills the frame. It relates to the example of the portrait lens shooting at an object, where it's zoomed in, focusing and amplifying the subject to the viewer. Spatially, this is related to the amplification of an object by placing it in a smaller, closed space. The second theme in film composition is editing techniques, which is used in connecting a series of discrete scenes, often narratively and usually in production out of sequence, to produce a coherent cinematic narrative. Film simulates the passage of time using cut and montage to curate the speed of events. In architecture, techniques of editing control the rhythm and continuity of experiencing space. In the parallel study of Being John Malkovich, the editing of the scene contained cuts to shots of the subject in multiple types of views. In this image, where the scene is represented as a linear vertical passage from one end to another, the glitch, texture, and flow of line work indicate the moments of temporal break in the scene. Without the edits in this scene, the intense atmosphere, curiosity of the subject, and the mysterious narrative would not have been able to be conveyed to the audience. The third theme in film composition is narrative techniques, which addresses the broad range of emotions portrayed and provoked in film. They include emotions such as anger, fear, and joy. Narrative techniques are essential to translate into architecture as they demonstrate the absorption of film by the spectator and whether the narrative reflects on the belief of the spectator. In Being John Malkovich, the composition of this scene is essential to the narrative of the film. By highlighting all the details with close-up shots and construction of the atmosphere of the scene, it is able to draw the audience into believing the events of the film. Through the research and case study analysis, 4 elements of cinematic design were identified that attempt to develop methods of cinematic composition in architecture. Camera tools are used in the thesis in an attempt to manipulate spatial understanding and perception for the user. In one way, translating the movement and actions of the camera will result in space that curates the movement and experience of the body. By manipulating scale, boundaries, and organization, cinematic space will alter viewers' perception and help the user articulate cinematic qualities in their environment. Reimagining the camera and editing techniques, the machine challenges the way the user would normally move through their environment and try to initiate a physical discussion between the user and space, and action and response. Cinematic space contains montage and the editing of space through the juxtaposition of events, materiality, and ambiances. Montage edits the temporality of space through continuity or discontinuity. The use of contrasting materials and events results in gaps in the experience of space, creating disruption of visual and experiential flow. Spatial layering of cinematic and architectural techniques draw focus through contrast, sharpness, light and acoustical control, framing, and scale. Furthermore, montage is also manifested in the natural condition and experience of the structure itself. In Villa Savoye, the natural decay of space creates progression of powerful images over a long period of time. The condition of decay is what created an awareness of space for the visitors. The odors, falling plaster, and graffitied walls transform the architecture to another state, sequential like a montage. Response to space embodies the user's individual desires in architecture. Contrasting between intense and passive settings, the user experiences dynamic duality of bodily instinct. Unconventional design of space helps us to understand the significance of architectural interruptions that break the flow of space and cause the user to be aware of their body placement within an environment. Small-scale contrast is achieved through changes in color, texture, material, etc. The brain selects informative details such as curves, contrasting edges for recognizing or remembering an object. In comparison, the brain is idle in visually homogeneous environments due to lack of stimulation. Cinematic architecture is finally manifested by mise-en-scène. The single image, view, or moment of the space identifies the entire essence of the project. Mise-en-scène in architecture considers how the spatial relationships and tectonics can be organized to engage in an individual and produce bodily response. Lighting, sound, props, mood, and setting are the 5 elements used in the design of an architectural mise-en-scène. Exploring the spatial composition in mise-en-scène creates a sense of time and place essential to the reception of the architecture which unfold over time. The Rest Hut tackles the issue of spatial consciousness by using cinematic technique to provoke mindfulness in the way we dwell. The vernacular typology of the hut allows for a flexible program and use of local materials in the construction of the hut. Located in Meriden, Connecticut, Castle Craig marks the location for the proposed resting hut. The dramatic formation of the rock becomes the object that unfolds for the user as they maneuver through the space. The rock will act as one presence in the space that will be manipulated with a man-made materiality to form a montage of space and events. The following sequences of images deploys the language of film to communicate the Rest Hut's essence of space and program. Like the sequence of a film, the Rest Hut develops itself with a series of spaces that are anticipated one after another. Traveling through the hut unfolds the cinematic composition that is realized by the user. The passenger is injected into the collision of the natural rock and the man-made architectural formation. The Rest Hut is a dynamic space. It is not fixed in program or experience. It becomes as the user travels through, and the interactions become scenes of the unfolding human experience. The following is a passage from the images. The feet of the passenger are numb from the travel. He rests for a second, gazing. When he walks around the room, he feels at home. His home never felt home, but the unbothered rock feels like home. The sauna, concrete, wood, light, air, rock, and body. This is all his home. The Rest Hut is experienced through 5.5 layers of space. By cutting and vacating the rock to interject the Rest Hut, we see the intentional use of montage to create a contrasting textural environment, unique from the architecture created from single objects. Here, 2 objects are at play and juxtaposed to create series of event spaces through the hut. The top level holds the elevator, stairs, and closet. This level incorporates the light as a tool of temporal movement, as light creates space in film. Similarly, the fragmented and misfit roof in this level creates glazed openings that allow for the light to filter through and reveal and hide moments of the space. The opening in the wall and roof also allow for weathering conditions to enter, allowing the user to experience the duality of interior and exterior at once, with provoking passages descending further down and elements distorting and hiding the view beyond. This transitional space is ephemeral in its composition. Another set of stairs bring the passenger down to shifted and isolated plane of the living room. As the hiker descends to the living room, their perception is distorted by the strength and light spots. Here the quality of time is disrupted, and emotions of confusion and uncertainty are at play. The living room becomes a center stage of interaction as it is located on a shifted plane isolated between level 2 and 3. The spatial layering in this space alludes to a montage of events, where users from above can interact with users in the living room, and consequently, the users in the living room are able to connect with the users in the kitchen below. The third level situates the dining room and kitchen. The displacement of the plane from above causes a shift in the formation on the floor, similar to actions of cut and shot, allowing the disruption of view. The spaces here are compressed and fragmented. The condensed nature of the dining area forces intimacy in the atmosphere. It allows the body to feel the closeness of materiality and enhances the dialogue between the passenger and other objects or people in the room. The kitchen is broken up and fragmented around the erupted boulder. Function is not optimized in the kitchen. It allows it to be reconfigured in the future depending on the needs of the space and the needs of the rock. Also on level 3, a corridor of the dining room leads to the east wing of the hut. Dimensions of the room are compressed to thoroughly captivate the passenger with the view. The pivoting windows act as both lens and aperture for the spectator. Contrasting dimensions and programs of the spaces in the east wing is a method of cuts and dissolves applied for a montage experience. Stairs from the colored corridor lead the passenger outside the hut and down to the 4th level. Cinematic assembly creates spaces that squeeze and intertwine with the rock. Density is used as a technique to explore time where the spatial arrangement affects the progression of speed and time through the space. The rock provides density to this level, creating breaks in spatial flow between the kitchen and the living room. While the kitchen and dining are in continuous flow, the rock is introduced to interrupt and separate the living room. Placing objects in the path disrupts the user's movement through the space, creating a choreographed space of event. The 5th level, shifted off to the west side, contains the bedroom, and then rises to a transition room and sauna room further above. Mise-en-scène is portrayed in the close-up room on level 5. Here the passenger is in the most condensed and highly sensorial space of the hut. With views facing directly onto the rock, this room displaces the passenger in an intimate condition with nature and oneself. The large openings in the wall frame the rock and provide access to reach out and touch it. With the opening bringing in weathering conditions, it becomes a portal to the outer world. This user is in 2 dimensions at once, in a new spatial reality. The final layer in this journey is a sauna, a layer that releases and reconnects the body, rock, and built environment. The sauna proposes a condition directly impacting the body and forcing a permanent reaction from the user. The event of the sauna holds significance as a social space, as well as a cleansing and recalibration end to the journey through the rest hut. Here the body is going through intense changes in temperature from normal to extreme heat, which is used as a final technique of montage. The end of the journey in the rest hut is a cleanse of the body through the use of natural material, light, and elevation, allowing the body to extend beyond the walls into the atmosphere. As the rest hut sits in the rock, over time it will go through a montage sequence of its own. As the structure has invaded the rock will reclaim its space over time, leaving memories of events within its cuts and forms. Cinematic space evokes the conscious spatial experience in the way we dwell. Rather than passively approaching space that is focused on the functions and aesthetics, cinematic architecture anchors the passenger in the spatial temporal reality where they can establish the connections between body and space. By incorporating ideologies of cinema in design, it reveals opportunity for enrichment in everyday life while uncovering the cinematic spectacle of architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Gulmeena. We have time for any questions, if particularly Evan and Andrew, who have not seen this project before, if you have any questions about clarification, things that weren't clear or things that you would like a bit more information on, now's the time to ask. So maybe first.
Sorry, I do. Yes, just a quick, and I think it's clarification. I'm wondering how do you envision the project being used? Is it temporary? Is it something that's found by the user and only used momentarily or for a day, or is this a long-term residence, or can you?
Right.
Does that matter to you?
So the typology of a rest hut, it is temporary. It is encountered as the user journeys up to the hike, journeys up to the cliff, and it's not a permanent residence. Obviously, it's a break from your daily life. So they go through this experience and they just reconnect with the body. Yeah, so it's not a permanent typology.
Is it meant to be a known destination as well in your narrative or in your intentions?
It's, I would say yes, if the person, like as you start at the bottom of the cliff, you can see it from that location. But as you gradually go up, then it begins to disappear. So in a way, it's playing with like uncertainty whether it is still there or not. And then when you reach the top, you're sorry, you can only see sort of that the structure erected on the top of the cliff, and you don't know yet how to go down.
Right. So what I'm wondering is that the kind of enigmatic presence of this thing, is it a curiosity in the landscape, or, once you start to understand it? I mean, I'm coming from the point of view of a filmmaker, and so I'm really curious about, because you invoke a lot of the discussions about narrative that we always get into as we're trying to tell stories, because that's basically what we do as human beings, let alone as filmmakers. So I'm really curious about the element of surprise. I'm also really curious about, like I said, the enigma of this thing. I mean, I look at it, of course I look at it and I know it's a piece of architecture, so as an enigma, it could, now this is only something that's speculative on my part too, immediately I start thinking, do you have to show me that it's architecture? Can you make it more kind of mysterious or more kind of irrational from that point of view? I wonder whether you explored that. I guess that's part of my wonders, my questions.
Right. So I guess to kind of direct that, it's you don't. I think coming from the point of the passenger that is not familiar with architectural concept, the hut itself, like as you travel through it, there's forced spaces that curate the body to duck down, whether they're too small for a space to kind of squeeze through, or step out of their known perception on how to live like in their home. So it's, as you're going through the hut, there are different sequences as well. So there's the idea of memory that you might experience on one level that may seem familiar on the last level. I don't know
if I can jump in for a second, Gulmeena. I'm not sure if it's clear to the people who are new to your project that the view you have on the screen right now is the hiker or the walker having climbed the mountain now approaching this constructed form, which is, we don't see it because there's some trees on the right, but it's at the edge of the cliff or the precipice.
Right.
So somehow
Right.
aware that I think something that's key to the way you've been conceiving this is this awareness that we're at the edge, looking back over a valley, and we see this hut. But all of that stuff that you then showed us, if you go up one slide, 44, is actually out of our view mostly, right? It's kind of
Right.
in the cliff and below us, below the
Yeah.
precipice. Sorry if if that was apparent to everyone. I'm sorry, but right, there's that kind of there's this very big thing that that Gulmeena has designed, but you don't have access to understanding the scale, the extent of it. There isn't this architect's overview of the unfolds. Thing for me to have said, Gulmeena?
Right. Yeah.
No, okay. That actually does help me to understand it a lot more, because I mean, generally, of course, and this is part of the kind of conceit of the architect, is there's an orthodoxy in it as well. You know, there's a everything's recognizable, because I'm in a way I'm provoking it in my own mind. I'm provoking it. Like, why does the dining room table have to look like a dining room table? You know, and how far how far can you distend or attenuate or, you know, push the expectations away to
Right.
present a kind of, you know, a different view of the world? And I completely empathize, or I'm in sympathy with the idea of understanding proprioception, you know, how you actually understand your body in space. It's a serious preoccupation of mine, and proximity to things, you know, known things or unknown things is a really critical part of how I understand the way that I tell stories, at least, or the way that I try to tell stories. I don't know how successful I am at moments. So I'm really curious about this, and I love the idea that it's actually embedded, or it's actually responding to the kind of the natural form of this mountain. It's a little bit on the nose in that it's at the top of a peak, you know, from my point of view, but it's so I think that it could actually benefit from being a little bit, even though it's mostly disguised or not exposed, I should say, that it could probably benefit from digging a little bit deeper into the cliff, or being sort of in the side of it more. Or I mean, maybe I'm totally off base about this, but I'm wondering
Maybe go to your AXO view, Gulmeena, where you exploded.
I'd love to see that again. Because there's a real beauty to it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to actually kind of push it a little deeper into how I understand it. And maybe it's my lack of understanding. Yeah, got it. It's buried as well. At its peak, it's buried to some extent.
I think I'm going to just jump in and support Evan's comment on, you know, what's interesting to me about, I mean, I do a lot of work. It wasn't really an introduction, but the Rome work was really about cinema, and I've done a few projects, a film school in Vancouver, and then a couple of smaller projects that are really based on kind of vagaries or of cinema, the sort of hidden potentials. And this notion that you move into this space and it's a bit didactic, I guess I would say. I think the project could benefit from embracing those sort of mysteries, those inherent overlaps, those inherent potential interpretations that come from at least the cinematic references that you were using. They're not overtly accessible pieces of cinema, and the architecture of the project is beautiful. Yeah, again, I agree with Evan. It's really well controlled, and but how it can sort of, I guess it seems that the project generally defaults to the mechanisms of cinema. You create a series of rooms based on those mechanisms of cinema. They're almost directly programmatically related, where mise en scene occurs in the sauna. I may have those mixed up, but certain things occur in certain rooms, so that it's very, very controlled. And I guess that's that's clearly interesting in your cinematic sequence, that beautiful kind of sequence of images where they overlapped. It was really, really a beautiful sequence of images, and you're moving through the project. And it's like you could have just left the project there at a certain point, and then just discovered kind of what's happening in each room. And yeah, the dining room table becomes somewhere where you sit and look at a view. But then when we start to get into, well, this is the sauna and this is where this, to me, it becomes a little bit almost too defined. The beauty of cinema, the notion that one room can do many things, just like one scene can do many things, depending on the mood in which you engage one scene. I mean, that's why I kind of was interested in that first question about how you perceive this thing to be used. You know, the idea of a hut or a resting hut as a temporal thing, because then it becomes, then it doesn't, it can be quite simple, because not everybody's going to use it over and over again. Just like you can return to a film, you know, we all have our favorites that we return to. You can return to the hut, and you can return to it at a different point in your life where you're responding to different notions of meaning within it, and it gives you different things, like a film. And it seems to me that's the potentials of this project that could be explored. That's just one overarching thing in terms of the way the thing was presented, but you've got the potentials there. I think the thing could be literally at a quarter of its scale and still give all those things back, because you've got so much ammunition. You've built so much ammunition to get yourself there, and you could compress these moments within these architectures, and you really don't have to. It reminds me of an early Morphosis house where they were just spread out and they depended on all these different components to create different moments, and then somehow you have to pull those things together in your mind. You're using a Shumi reference, so I'm going as far back as you did. So
well, no, I'm with you.
I think there's an inherent tension, though, for me, because the work that I've done in cinema is almost, I mean, it's a big bucket cinema, and Evan has the great has had the I guess the joy of working within it all his life, whereas I kind of get to dabble in it only when projects allow. But this notion of my preoccupation has been movement. It's all about movement. It's the fact that the screen is moving, the image is moving. There's this, the cinematic notion is really about the contemporary understanding that we're moving through the city, and that the sequences of the way in which a city is conceived is very different than the sequence in which we perceive it now, because we're in cars, on motorcycles, bicycles, whatever. So for me, there's an inherent tension in talking about that component of cinema and then putting yourself in this point of stasis on the top of the hill, because it really is, you can't go any further, right? You're on the edge, and now all of a sudden you can't move. So the project itself, I want to call it a house, but I know it's not. The project itself becomes a kind of generation of movement, I guess, through view planes and that sort of thing. Anyway, I just want to make sure, I'm aware of that inherent tension, that you're putting yourself in this position of stasis. And anyway, those are my two sort of, I guess, general points.
Yeah, I could pick up on some of this, and maybe I'm saying the same things as Evan and Andrew have said, but I'm going to just take a slightly different approach to it. And I'm going to go back to Being John Malkovich, right? Because you used it as a primary reference. You know, in the scenes that you analyzed from Being John Malkovich, there's a series of absurd, almost impossible situations, right? There's the tiny door. There's the tunnel, right, which feels almost organic. And then there's ending up inside John Malkovich's brain, right? So we have three things immediately that are at best absurd, right? And at most impossible.
Right.
So film has the possibility of showing us spatial configurations that are absurd or are impossible, and can use that for a certain effect. And I just want to suggest that architecture can do that too, right? Especially architecture that no one's ever going to build, right? And it's a little bit, I would say, disappointing that absurdity gets lost in your project, right? because
Right.
I think it stopped you from really investigating what architecture means in certain scenarios. Right? And just as an example, when the dining room becomes a dining room, right, then all of a sudden you're locking it down into something that is known. Instead of, say, there's this space and someone might eat in it, right? What does that mean, right? So in terms of investigating how cinema and architecture might connect, a little bit more looseness on the side of architecture, a little bit more willingness to engage in the absurdities of the cut from cinema might be interesting. For example, you know, we know you come in the front door of this space, of this object that you've designed, right? Maybe you get into the elevator, but where do you come out? Right? Right now, the elevator takes you down a floor into the next level of the house, and then you walk down the stairs. But the elevator could take you out into Times Square, right? Or it could let you out on the moon, right?
Okay.
Yeah, because what you're pointing to there actually is a kind of irrational narrative, you know.
That's
and,
right.
And that film is brilliant at that.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And you know what? One of the primary ideologies, you talked about ideologies a fair amount, right? But one of the primary ideologies of architecture is that it makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. So film challenges that ideology, right? And so there's an opportunity in working with film in architecture to challenge that ideology, to ask, does the architecture here have to make sense? Or by not making sense, might it suggest some other ways of understanding space or understanding things or understanding who we are?
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that, sorry, you were going to answer.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
No, it's okay. Was that, who's speaking there? I don't have the screen. Is that Colin or was that?
Yes, that was me, Andrew.
Okay. I thought I recognized the voice. I just don't have this is one of the weird things about this mechanism is like,
yeah, it only shows, at least mine only shows 5 screens at a time.
Yeah, I got 4, but it's okay. I guess we can modify that if I had the knowledge. I kind of agree. It's like at a certain point you have to accept that this project just accepts a whole bunch of paradigms that ideologically are just accepting what architecture is. I had a whole half a page just wondering where your program emerged from and why there was an acceptance of these basic rooms within what a house should be. You know, because Colin's right. At a certain point, even within architecture, you can say that you walk into a room and you expect a certain view, you expect a certain experience. That's what film does really well. Setting up expectations, changing those expectations, and through the shifting of those expectations, adding a layer of criticality or meaning or experience. But even without pushing you from Connecticut to Times Square, you can push you from an expected understanding, a foreshadowed expectation, and then a new expectation. Yeah. And I think, so those are tying those things together. It's a little bit more pragmatic. It's a little bit more, not pragmatic, it's a little bit more normative in the sense that you could do that without breaking through the fourth wall, without shifting the paradigm. I agree with shifting the paradigm all about it. I think it's absolutely amazing that cinema can take you from your living room to Piazza Santa Maria in Trastevere in a half a second, right? And but your project doesn't want to do that. It actually doesn't want to do that. But it can still transform us or transport us. And I think this notion of all of a sudden hanging on to a more normative program, I agree 100% with Colin. It's like, why? It's like it's a sheltering hut where somebody's going to experience for half an hour. Why define the rooms? Like I don't think it's necessary, and I think it could tighten up the project.
One of the most cinematic buildings that I've come across, and I'm sorry that this didn't occur to me until today, is quite famous. It's the, what's his name's? The Bruder, the chapel in a field by, what's his name, by the Swiss architect.
Peter Zumthor.
By Zumthor, right. Which is quite amazing. You see it first from, I don't know, 150 yards away, 150 meters away, and it's a perfectly square piece of concrete, right?
Right.
And you walk to it through this cornfield or wheat field, and it gets, you know, slowly gets larger and larger and larger. And then there's this, you get to it and there's this strange triangular door. You open the door and go in, and all of a sudden you're in a different world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I'm not going to talk about that world because I want you to look it up, right? But this for me is about the movement, the seeing the thing from different positions, the time, the expectation, and then that sudden transformation into something completely different.
Right.
Right. All of which is latent in the project that you've done. I think just a little bit of tweaking might have brought these things really out into the forefront. And you know, again, agreeing with Andrew, I think when you have the labels for all of the rooms, that
Mm-hmm.
takes away from the effects.
Right. Right.
So you wanted to get a lot more elemental, and it's almost like what I would call a storyboard. So you, which also then refers back to Corb's, you know, the architectural promenade, or is the controlled experience of movement, right, through this thing, because you're on it already. You're definitely on it. Because the opposite side of that is this kind of gaming metaphor where you walk in and you can kind of, you know, what's your choice? Where are you going to go? But you've actually got entire, like it's in your hands, you know, to manipulate the body through the space. So I don't mean to divert the conversation there, Colin. You just got my mind firing when you start talking about this kind of sequential revelation, and then and everybody's talking about this kind of defying expectations or redefining expectations, or however you want to characterize it. And it is all latent in your project. It's true. The kind of next step is to, I mean, you can take this a long way, a long, long way. The bones are really there, you know.
Right.
Pardon me.
Yeah.
Marco, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm good. I'm happy to just be an observer. I'm enjoying this discussion. I think, you know, we've had some of these points come up in earlier milestones, and I think it's interesting to see, you know, I think the project has developed a lot since the last milestone, and I'm really happy to see that. But I don't have anything particularly substantive to add given the expertise that's on this panel.
If we've got some time, I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of the thesis, because there's, to me, it seems like as I went through the document, admittedly last night with a couple of glasses of wine, and then this morning, seeing you presented it in a slightly different way, I actually think it's almost a study in mechanisms or methodologies. And you could take the overarching construct of this thesis, take the components, the sequences that you've gone through that take you from theory, understanding, history, to the projection of a project on a cliff. And you could say, well, I'm going to do it about painting next, or I'm going to do it about something else, some other discipline next. It really is a kind of tectonic delamination of the cinematic process. So when you talk about ideologies at the beginning, I don't think it's about ideology at all. Actually, I actually think you're not that. I do lots of transdisciplinary work. We're doing work with artists right now in Montreal. We're doing work with filmmakers. What we try to pull out of that is actually the tensions between the disciplines and how they can inform each other, and how does that form some sort of hybridized discipline. What you seem to do is depending heavily on these cinematic techniques, these cinematic mechanisms, these definitions, and then having them overlay onto an architecture. And I guess this is both a good thing and a bad thing. You could do the same thing with painting, even different realms of painting. You could do the same thing with, you probably couldn't do it with brain surgery, but you could do it with other art forms, which I think, so in the end, it's, you know, you can put Thesis into buckets. Is it really about architectural representation? Is it really about the socioeconomic issues, blah, 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 blah. This one is really about process, and it's about delaminating one process and applying it to another condition. So if you're going to learn something from this, I think it's this notion that the transdisciplinary processes, the way you've delaminated this sequence. I don't know if this makes any sense at all. This is where I kind of go off the deep end. But anyway, I think it's an interesting process, but it's not that interested in how cinema changed the way we look at the world. It's not that interested in how, you know, even how specifically Tarkovsky changed the way we look at the world. It's more interested in the techniques within those cinematic moments. So I think you have to accept that, right? You have to accept that you're saying these things exist. I'm not interested in the ideological revolutions. I'm more interested in how they made the product. Is that fair? I think it touches on Colin's comment about, you know, this sort of change in, you know, going down the elevator, opening up on Times Square, and then all of a sudden your perception of the world is radically, it's like when we embrace abstraction or whatever it is. Anyway, that was sort of I always try to understand where a thesis lands and what the question is.
Right, and I agree. Like, so the primary aim as I was going through this was to look at the direct translation of those techniques, and that was the underlying kind of idea as I was doing all the research and exploration. And I think it was because through my research, there was a lot less focus on the direct translation, which is why I was intrigued to explore it. And I think that's where that's where the final hut. That's why there are those moments of intensity that are basically precedents for moving forward. How now you can take this space and direct it under the other notion of cinema that Colin has been speaking about. So yeah.
We're gonna have to wrap up soon, but Arthur, do you want to say anything?
I'm taking in this conversation I think it's fantastic how this work that Gulmeena's presented this morning has basically being a launching off point for this conversation, which I think has just towards the end been acknowledged in some ways is leaping into some of the areas that Gulmeena hasn't looked at or hasn't seen latently in her work, or maybe is it all in some ways as well is a reflection of what she's chosen to present and how, right, the means of structuring her narrative today has kind of led, which is always when you're with someone for a whole year and at that table, it's much broader and that gets distilled down, and yet what opened up this morning in many ways is into areas that are significantly new, I think, to this work, and yet it's this work supporting that very interesting discussion. So I couldn't have hoped for more from this milestone in terms of what the students' material has brought for or allowed to bring forth in the conversation. Yeah, I'm happy to be a fly on the wall taking this in. And I'm glad to have been able to work with you this year, Gulmeena. And we'll, in a few minutes, I'll Zoom you and we'll talk about some more.
All right.
Like I said, we have to finish off, but are there any final comments, particularly from Evan or Andrew, before we wrap up this stage?
No, Gulmeena, this is nice work. It's really like Arthur was saying, that it's provoked a lot of good discussion, and it reminds me of some of the excitement that I get when I start to analyze and I even begin a project of my own. You know, in the distillation of idea, it's a really good foundation for starting a career.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. Thank you very much. It's there's some beautiful drawings. This is a great drawing. The one you've got. You're obviously smart in that you'll finish with the great drawing, and the cinematic moments. If I was going to end with anything, I think you have Antonio's sequence from The Passenger. I love the fact that your user was called The Passenger through the whole project.
Yeah,
it's really, you just sort of left it hanging there. But I also think there's, I think it's the 7 minutes and 20 seconds of the end of that film, which is really just, it has everything that you're trying to explore in your thesis, but it has it in 7 minutes. And that notion that the project could be compressed into that, I think would be the next steps if you were to move forward. But thank you very much. It was a great experience and lovely work. And thanks for the conversation, guys. It's I'm buried in my linen closet. I don't get to have these conversations much. So.
Okay, so Gulmeena, at this point, we'll end the discussion and thank you for your presentation and thank you for all your work. We'll ask you to leave, and Mike also, if you could switch off the live stream and the recording. And then Gulmeena, Arthur will get back to you once we finished our discussion. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.